In 1924, a very small man with a very, very large heart, a glorious being called Mahatma Gandhi, said, "I believe in the absolute oneness of God and therefore also of humanity. What though we have many bodies, we have but one soul." Wasn't that a glorious thing to say? And what I'm particularly giving thanksgiving for today, and have been giving thanksgiving for throughout the last 25 years or so of my life, is this extraordinary stroke of fortune that has allowed us all to live at a time when we can truly benefit from the incredible wisdom of our forebears, whether it has come from the east or from the west, from the north or from the south. This is the first time in human history that we have been able to listen with an open heart to traditions that may not necessarily be our own in the most immediately understood sense of that, but are truly our own in the truth of that. That is, we are able to listen to one another without needing to convert, to show contempt, to be in extreme awe and wonderment that other people have something that we're not entitled to. No. Where these gems truly glitter and glisten, they belong to all of us without exception. That is an incredible thing, isn't it? That we are living in this time. And even in these services, and maybe sometimes especially in these services, we hear the different melodies coming from the different faiths. And yet they sing such a similar song, don't they? So on this very day, you've heard Kim sing to us in Arabic and in Hebrew. You've heard Heather sing to us from the Indian tradition. You're going to hear them both sing together from the Ladino tradition later on. You've heard teachings from different traditions. And you've heard one song. You've heard one song, a song of hope. You've heard one song, a song of love. You've heard one song, a song of unity. You've also heard one song that invites you to celebrate difference rather than being afraid of it. If there is to be a goal of spiritual understanding, if there is to be, because actually the process matters much more than the goal, but if there is to be a goal of spiritual understanding, then it is surely to recognize what we share. Because until we recognize what we share, we cannot and will not keep one another safe. We do keep the people safe when we recognize our unity with them. We fail to keep them safe when we fail to recognize that. So this is not just about our own individual well-being. It is also about the well-being of our human and divine family. At this time in our crowded world, we must take seriously that we belong to a single family, and that the differences between us are fascinating, but they are not reason to divide us. Our thinking is absolutely critical here. Not just what we think about, but even how we think, how we use this faculty that we call the mind. How we interrogate what we take for granted and ask, how well is it serving us? How well is it serving others? How well is it serving me as I move through the world, influencing it at least as much as I am influenced by it? Above thought, in a metaphorical sense, you also have the witnessing mind. You can observe your thinking and you can shift its direction. And one of the reasons to come to services like this and to hear the teachings that the liturgies make available to you is to realize that we also need inspiration in order to listen to our own thoughts with some delicacy and some subtlety and some curiosity, and again ask, how well is this serving us? Some of you have been in the presence this week of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Some of you have heard his messages and maybe even remarked on how powerfully simple he can sometimes afford to be, and how adroitly he moves through the clutter that often gives us reasons why things can't be as simple as they need to be. I used a quote from him at the very beginning of my book, Everyday Kindness, which said, "Be kind whenever possible. It is always possible." In thinking about our thinking, we could apply that. Is my thinking kind? Is my thinking inclusive? Is my thinking grateful? Is my thinking hopeful? And if not, what do I need in order to reignite the passion of love in my heart? I'm going to read you a very favorite poem that again brings us together. Define and narrow me, you starve yourself of yourself. Nail me down in a box of cold words, and that box is your coffin. I do not know who I am. In other words, don't identify with your limitations. Don't identify with your label. Even if you love some of the things about who and what you are, don't identify with them only. Identify with yourself as a member of this amazing, divine family. I am in astounding lucid confusion, says Rumi. I am not a Christian, I am not a Jew, I am not a Zoroastrian, I'm not a Muslim. I do not belong to the land or to any known or unknown sea. Nature cannot own or claim me, and nor can heaven. Nor can India, China, or Bulgaria. My birthplace is placelessness. My birthplace is placelessness. Isn't that beautiful? My sign to have and give no sign. You say you see my mouth, ears, eyes, nose. They are not mine. I am the life of life. I am that cat, this stone. I'm no one. I have thrown duality away like an old dish rag. I see and know all times and worlds as one, one, always one. So what do I have to do to get you to admit who is speaking? Admit it and change everything. This is your own voice echoing off the walls of God. And now I want to tell you two very, very quick, very small, very personal stories, even though that's not something that I usually do. Both of these stories are told at greater length in Seeking the Sacred, so if you've heard them before, that's very fine. The first comes from a retreat that I gave at Mana some years ago, and we were well into the retreat. And one of the women at the retreat, a young woman who had been to several retreats, so I knew her quite well, was speaking about herself in a very restricting kind of a way, in a way that was quite painful to hear. And I imagine that this was the way that she quite often spoke to herself. So I asked her to stand, and I went and stood in front of her, and I said to her, "Kristen, you are enough." And it was a real sacramental moment that I was just pushed to say this. But really, it wasn't difficult because I could see it. I could see through the eyes of love that she, like all of you, is enough. So I asked everybody to stand, and we stood, and I stood in front of each person and said their name and said, "You are enough." And of course we were all weeping because of all the countless, innumerable times that we have believed through our limited consciousness that we are not enough, that you are not enough, that the other is not enough, that the self is not enough, that enough is not enough, that nothing is enough. Because we have been so afraid to let in and entirely surrender to the possibility of presence, the possibility of love that is so infinite. The word enough is like the tiniest pebble on the beach beside that ocean of love in which we all swim. The second of the stories could reflect in a different way on my years of devotion to those teachings, which is that a year before I was ordained, and I was ordained in 2005, so the year before I was ordained, I had a real run-in with a very senior member of the seminary where I was studying. And I knew that the next year when I was ordained that he would be present and in fact would be part of the ordaining group. And I was a little bit anxious about this. But when it came to my actual ordination, I experienced him in a way that his personality and his views, and my personality and my views, were utterly irrelevant. It was an incredibly powerful part of being ordained as an interfaith minister. And I was so grateful that I had those difficulties with him, because otherwise I could not possibly have experienced that totally unexpected moment of transcendence, a moment in which I entirely got over my own self-righteousness, not through any act of will, but just through an act of grace, and could also experience him in his wholeness and in his holiness. And I would not have been able to experience either of those things if we had not most uncomfortably rubbed up against one another. So sometimes when you come up against someone whose views you entirely distrust or entirely disdain, perhaps you could also think about what an opportunity this is, also to embrace that person. Not their views necessarily, of course not. We should continue to speak up for what we believe is right. But to recognize that for all the respect we must have for each other's boundaries, we are as Gandhi told us, members of an absolutely single family. We're having a real day of poetry today. So I'm going to finish with Hafiz. I am in love with every church. I am in love with every mosque, temple, and any kind of shrine, because I know it is there that people say the different names of one God. And you know, I find that too. I find that I am quite in love with any situation in which love is consciously present. And that word present is so important because we are, and this was something I reflected on last week when I gave the witness here at Pitt Street, we are the presence of love. How else can love be present except through us? We are always in the presence of love. We have only to remember. Would you tell your friends, says Hafiz, I was a bit strange if I admitted I am indeed in love with every mind and heart and body. Oh, I am sincerely crazy about your every thought and yearning and limb, because, my dear, I know it is through these that you search for the one. I know there are different names for God, but there is only one. One. There is only one. Blessed be.